This is the shorter version of a longer, more in-depth video. Unfortunately, I have a deadline for this project and that deadline is rapidly approaching, so the scope of this video is somewhat scaled back from what I wanted to make. I'm sorry if I leave out any details that you would consider important. If I ever find time, I will make the much longer version of this video that I initially planned for. With that out of the way, this is the entire history of Afghanistan and the empires that formerly occupied that region from 1709 to 2021. Our story begins in the year 1709, when Mirwais Hotak, a leader of the tribal Hotak people, led a revolution against the Safavid dynasty of Persia, which controlled the region at the time. The ruler of Persia, Sultan Hussein, attempted to put down the rebellion but was unsuccessful, and Mirwais established the Hotak Empire. Mirwais would die in 1715 and was succeeded by his son Mahmud, who attempted to expand the empire by invading Persia. After a 6-month siege on the capital of Isfahan, Hussein abdicated the throne and Mahmud became Shah of Persia in 1722. In the midst of the siege, Hussein's son, Tahmasp II, fled to the north and attempted to raise an army and re-establish control of Persia. Meanwhile, back in Isfahan, Mahmud was widely disliked by his subjects and had his own cousin, Ashraf, imprisoned because everyone preferred him. In 1725, he got assassinated, probably by Ashraf after royal guards helped him escape prison. Control of the empire was then split between Ashraf and his cousin Hussein. Ashraf controlled the conquered territories in Persia, while Hussein controlled the homeland. A year later, Tahmasp gained the support of a man named Nader, leader of the Afshar people, and made him his right-hand man. With Nader's support, the pair raised an army and started to recapture cities in the north. After just 3 years of campaigning, Ashraf was ousted by Nader and Tahmasp and was killed during his retreat to homeland territory. Nader then installed Tahmasp as Shah. However, another 3 years later, Tahmasp was deposed by Nader and replaced on the throne by Tahmasp's son, Abbas III, who was then deposed and replaced by Nader himself in 1736. Nader then conquered the city of Kandahar, the capital of the Hotak Empire, and killed Hussein, ending the Hotak dynasty. The following year, Nader invaded India and sacked Delhi, along with his trusted cavalry commander, Ahmad Durrani. After 8 years of Persian rule, Nader became increasingly tyrannical in his reign and was assassinated. Following his death, Ahmad returned to the city of Kandahar, where a council of tribal leaders unanimously named him their new emir. Throughout the next 2.5 decades, Ahmad began to expand his newfound dynasty, conquering parts of modern-day Pakistan and northern India, until in 1722 when he died of an unknown illness and was replaced by his son Timur. After another 21 years, Timur also died of natural causes. Timur had over 20 children, and while he named his eldest, Zaman, as his successor, Zaman was opposed by his many brothers, especially one named Mahmud. In response, he brought his brothers to Kabul, now capital of the empire, and then put them in prison until they agreed to submit. After a few months, Mahmud, having now pledged his allegiance to Zaman, was released and made governor of Herat, a large city in the far west. In the following years, Zaman attempted to expand the empire, but was brought back by Mahmud's constant attempts at rebellion. During the final one in 1800, Mahmud gathered an army and captured Kandahar. Zaman marched to meet Mahmud at the city of Ghazni, but by that point so many people had defected to Mahmud's side that Zaman's army fell apart. Mahmud then rose to the throne, and Zaman fled to Peshawar to meet up with his brother Shuja and lead an attack against Mahmud, but Mahmud defeated them both and blinded Zaman, leaving Shuja as his main competitor. In 1803, Shuja made an advance on Kabul, and this time he won, forcing Mahmud into hiding. During this time, Shuja traveled frequently to British India for diplomatic purposes, and in 1808, during a visit to Peshawar, Mahmud took the opportunity to come out of hiding, meet up with a former advisor of his named Fateh Khan, and seize the capital. Shuja then gathered his army and attempted to defeat Mahmud, however was beaten back several times and eventually fled to British India. Mahmud reinstated himself as Shah and made Fateh his wazir, or official top advisor. Fateh used this newfound power to appoint his own family members as high-ranking officials within the empire. 7 years later, a revolt broke out in Persia as a man named Firaz al-Din revolted against Shah Fath Ali Qajar from the city of Gurion, a mere 40 miles east of Herat. Fath Ali quickly took back the city and, because of an ongoing territorial dispute, made Herat a vassal of Persia. 2 years later, Firaz revolted again, this time from Herat itself, and asked Fateh for assistance. Fateh marched on Herat accompanied by his brother Dost Muhammad, but upon arriving he simply arrested Firaz and expelled Persia's ambassador from the city. Mahmud feared that Persia would see this as an act of war and sent his son Karman to confront Fateh and reinstate the ambassador, but upon arriving in Herat, Fateh refused to comply. Karman then raised an army and marched on the city under the guise of being there to congratulate Fateh, and once he arrived, invited him to dinner. Fateh accepted this invitation despite literally all of his advisors telling him not to, and at the dinner was stabbed in the eye, thrown in prison, and then sent to Ghazni to have his fate judged by Mahmud. Unsurprisingly, the trial ended with Mahmud cutting his head off. As you may recall, many officials in the Durrani Empire at this point were relatives of Fateh, and when they heard what happened to him, Mahmud lost control. With Fateh gone, his brother Azim became head of the family and began searching for another Durrani brother to install on the throne. Meanwhile, Dost Muhammad marched on Ghazni to capture Mahmud, who fled to Herat, where he would live in exile for the rest of his life. Azim decided to raise a Durrani named Ayyub to the throne. Ayyub was the final emperor of the Durrani dynasty, and his reign was basically ceremonial. In 1823, Ayyub was deposed, officially ending the Durrani Empire, the territory of which was divided among the members of Azim's family, called the Barakzais. Ghazni was given to Dost Muhammad, and Kabul was given to Dost's brother, Muhammad Khan Talai. Muhammad resigned after just 3 years, which allowed Kabul and Ghazni to be controlled by Dost, who began unifying the pieces of the former Durrani Empire under the new Barakzai dynasty. Dost was also the first ruler to give the nation the name of Afghanistan. By 1873, Afghanistan was sandwiched in between the Russian Empire and British India, and both countries raced to establish relations with Dost. Dost initially favored the British, however, when it became clear that they wanted control of the government rather than just an alliance, he sided with the Russians. The British were upset about this and manufactured evidence to justify an invasion, marching into the country in December of 1838 with the goal of establishing the still exiled British-loving Shuja Durrani as a puppet ruler. They steamrolled through both Kandahar and Ghazni, and Dost, sensing that he was outmatched, fled Kabul and immediately began trying to form a resistance in the north. In early 1839, Dost traveled to the neighboring state of Bukhara to gain the support of its leader, but he was instead placed under house arrest and wouldn't escape until the summer of 1840, when he found out the rest of his family had been taken back to Afghanistan. Furious, Dost raised an army and began taking back cities in northern Afghanistan. However, despite these victories, he would mysteriously choose to surrender himself to British forces and be exiled to India. Despite Dost's exile, rebellions started popping up as Shuja became increasingly unpopular, and on the 2nd of December 1841, Kabul erupted into chaos when a mob broke into the house of a British political officer and murdered him before taking back the capital. With Kabul back in Afghan hands, an agreement was reached that British troops would be peacefully allowed to leave. However, they were attacked anyways, and most of them were killed before they could fully withdraw. Around this time, Shuja would also be assassinated, basically just because people were sick of dealing with him. And following this, there were several British expeditions sent back into Afghanistan, but only a month later they withdrew for good under the orders of a new governor of India. Dost Muhammad was released from exile that same year and re-established control of Afghanistan, ending the First Anglo-Afghan War. 5 years later, the Sikh Empire collapsed, and with his biggest local enemy gone, Dost annexed several neighboring regions, including Hazarajat, Bamiyan, and Balkh. In 1855, Dost reconquered Kandahar. Then, 2 years later, the Afghans and the British jointly invaded Persia, and within less than a year, the region surrounding Herat was given to a Barakzai emir. Another 5 years after this, the emir of Herat invaded the also Barakzai-controlled region of Farah, and Dost used this as an opportunity to justify an invasion of both. Within a month, his army made their way to the city of Herat, which would fall following a 10-month siege, signaling the end of the reunification of Afghanistan. Just 2 weeks later, Dost passed away at the age of 69, leaving his son, Shur Ali Khan, to rule a newly reunified Afghanistan. During the reunification, Dost had appointed his various sons to rule different regions of the country, and upon his death, they all clamored for their spot at the throne. In 1864, Ali intercepted a treasonous letter sent by his brother Afzal. Furious, he marched on him, but Afzal changed his mind and recognized Ali's rule. However, Afzal's son, Abdur, went behind his back and made his own plans to overthrow Ali, which ended up with Afzal being imprisoned and Abdur fleeing north. The following year, Ali marched on Kandahar to defeat his brother Amin, and although he put down the revolt, Ali's son was killed in the fighting. The death of his son took a toll on his ability to lead, and just a year later, Afzal's forces defeated Ali's, leaving Afzal to take Kabul. Following this, Ali gained the support of the governor of Afghan Turkestan, and shortly after this, Afzal died of cholera, leaving his brother Azam and Abdur to fight for the throne. Ali came up with a plan to get the governor to distract Abdur with a siege to the far north, leaving him to come in from the south and take Kabul. The plan worked, and Ali took the city while Abdur was stuck on the other side of the country besieging Maiwana. Azam fled to Iran, and Abdur fled even further north. With his country finally at peace, Shur Ali became a bit of a reformist and spent the remainder of his reign working to rebuild and modernize Afghanistan. All was going well, and things were looking up for the country, and then the British started throwing another temper tantrum. In 1878, Russia sent an uninvited diplomatic envoy to Kabul. Despite Ali's best efforts, they refused to turn around, and after the British heard about this, they demanded that Ali also receive British diplomats, but Ali threatened to stop them if dispatched. The British then decided that war with Afghanistan was worth it if it meant that they could gain influence in the region before Russia, and invaded. The Afghans were no match for the British forces, who crippled the Afghan military. In desperation, Ali left Kabul to appeal to the Russians for assistance, however they refused, and Ali passed away on the journey home, leaving his son Yaqub on the throne. Yaqub knew that he couldn't resist the British, and just 2 months later he surrendered and signed the Treaty of Gandamak, relinquishing control of foreign affairs to British diplomats in Kabul. However, the treaty would be broken 4 months later after an uprising in Kabul led to the death of a British representative in the city and his entire staff. When news of the massacre reached British India, they deployed a second invasion force, defeating the Afghan army and occupying the capital capital just 2 days later. Yaqub was forced to resign as emir and go into exile in India. The British decided that Abdur Rahman Khan, still in exile, would replace Yaqub as emir, ascending him to the throne in 1880. Abdur reconfirmed the Treaty of Gandamak, and the British once again took control of Afghanistan's foreign policy, and not wanting to spark another uprising, British troops left the country in April of 1881. Aside from being a ruthless despot, Abdur is notable for two things: the negotiation of the Durrani Line, which would eventually become the modern border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and his son Habibullah, who took over after Abdur passed in 1901. While Abdur was cruel and strict, Habibullah was a reformist and spent much of his reign undoing his father's harsh policies. His reign was mostly peaceful, even managing to remain neutral in World War I. However, many people saw it as a betrayal of the Muslim faith to have not sided with the Ottomans, and many were sick of what they saw as the government pandering to Britain, and as a result, Habibullah was assassinated in February of 1919 by an unknown perpetrator. The next day, Habibullah's brother, Nasrullah, had himself crowned emir, and convinced Habibullah's two eldest sons to do the same. However, his third son, Amanullah, refused to recognize him and gained the support of the nobility, declaring war on Nasrullah, who backed down and abdicated 6 days after rising to power. Amanullah then told Nasrullah that he would let him do as he pleased on the condition that he returned to Kabul. He did so, and was instead arrested and killed in prison a year later. Amanullah now needed a way of gaining support, as despite being backed by the royalty, he was suspected by some to have had a role in his father's assassination. So, to ease these suspicions, Amanullah aligned his policies with his father's. However, Amanullah took this a step further, because he believed that Afghanistan should no longer be subjected to the Treaty of Gandamak. He used ongoing civil unrest as a result of the Indian independence movement as an opportunity to invade British India, marching troops across the border in March of 1919. The Third Anglo-Afghan War was a relatively short one. The British technically had the advantage in terms of numbers and technology, but faced problems like mass desertion and poor supply lines, and the war ended after just 3 months when the British signed the Treaty of Rawalpindi, finally relinquishing control of Afghanistan's foreign policy. Following the war, Amanullah started a campaign of further reform and modernization throughout Afghanistan, part of which included overturning centuries-old traditions relating to things like strict dress codes and women's rights. Afghanistan is a country in which tradition is held in high regard by many, and some at the time felt that these reforms were a step backwards. In March of 1924, the city of Khost declared an open revolt against the government, which turned into a rebellion spanning the entire southeast of the country. The rebels claimed that Amanullah was trying to de-Islamify the country. The rebellion was eventually quelled in January of 1925, when Amanullah's forces captured or killed some 40 rebel leaders. But rather than dial back on reforms in wake of the rebellion, Amanullah cranked it up to 11. He turned Afghanistan from an emirate to a kingdom, met with members of other faiths. Clearly, he was not going to back down, but maybe he should have. In 1928, Amanullah went off on a tour of Europe while things were getting increasingly bad back home. The protests over his reforms had not stopped, and in November of that same year, Shinwari tribesmen revolted in Jalalabad. As a response, Amanullah sent his brother-in-law, Ali Ahmad Khan, to deal with the tribal leaders. Fortunately, Ahmad was able to negotiate and the uprising was put down. However, just a few days later, an army led by Habibullah Kalakani, a former soldier in the Royal Army, started to march on Kabul. On December 14th, Kalakani attacked the capital, and the situation quickly became utter chaos as large swaths of the military defected rather than fight the rebels. Despite this, Amanullah managed to win the first battle of Kabul when on Christmas Day, Kalakani was injured by shrapnel from a bomb, forcing him to retreat and regroup. Kalakani fled to a fort north of Kabul, which Amanullah ordered his forces to begin shelling. However, with increasing opposition to his rule, Amanullah abdicated the throne after just 2 weeks, and on January 14th, 1929, he fled to British India, never to return again. His replacement was his younger brother, an Ayatollah, who abdicated the throne to Kalakani after just 3 days in power. Kalakani sat on the throne for just a few months before, in March of 1929, Mohammed Nadir Khan, a distant relative of Amanullah, returned to Afghanistan from France, where he had been serving as ambassador, and began organizing anti-Kalakani groups, taking various cities in the southeast of the country. By May 11th, Nadir's forces reached Kabul, and on October 13th, following a week-long siege on the royal palace, Kalakani was finally captured and executed. Nadir's reign was highlighted by his undoing of most of Amanullah's reforms, and he imprisoned anyone who he suspected could be a threat, which included many people of ethnic minority groups like Tajiks and Hazaras. In November of 1933, Nadir was hosting a ceremony to honor students from a local high school, and upon seeing the lack of security at the event, a Hazara student whose family had been arrested by Nadir's regime earlier that year went home, returned with a revolver, entered the ceremony, and then shot Nadir 3 times. Following Nadir's assassination, his son, Zahir Khan, would be placed on the throne. Zahir was a much more moderate king than his father, and helped bring Afghanistan onto the world stage. While he implemented many reforms throughout his reign, he mostly took small steps like establishing relations with countries like Italy and Germany. Despite these ties to many of the countries that would go on to form the Axis powers, Nadir remained neutral in World War II, making Afghanistan one of only 14 countries to not align themselves with either side. In 1964, Zahir introduced a new constitution, which had a provision that no member of the royal family, aside from the king, could serve in a position of political authority. This greatly affected Mohammed Daoud Khan, Zahir's cousin who had been serving as prime minister before the new constitution barred him from office. In late June of 1973, Zahir left for London to receive a medical procedure, and Daoud, sensing an opportunity, gathered his supporters from the army and marched on the royal palace. They encountered no resistance along the way, and in what is now known as the bloodless coup, Daoud ended the monarchy in a matter of hours. Following this, Daoud formed a republic with himself as president, and in 1977, he drafted yet another constitution declaring a one-party system. One thing that I've neglected to mention is that Daoud's coup had a socialist tint to it. Many members of the army that helped him seize control were members of a socialist political group called the PDPA. Daoud was uncomfortable with them having power within the government, and he started to replace PDPA officials with more moderates and Republicans. This distrust is likely one of the reasons why Daoud established a one-party state that was notably not socialist. On top of this, Afghanistan had good relations with the Soviet Union at the time, but as Daoud tried to distance his government from communist sentiment, relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated, and with it, relations with the PDPA. On April 17, 1978, an important member of the PDPA was assassinated, and despite him denying it, PDPA founder Nur Mohammad Taraki believed Daoud was responsible. 2 days later, when 15,000 protesters took to the streets at the funeral, Daoud ordered members of the PDPA leadership to be arrested. One of these arrestees was Hafizullah Amin, the general secretary for the PDPA, who was placed under house arrest, which gave him just enough freedom to order his supporters in the military to stage a coup, and a week later, they did. At noon on August 27th, tanks rolled into Kabul and fighting broke out throughout the city. By the following morning, the PDPA had gained complete control of the capital, Daoud Khan was dead, and Afghanistan was now a Soviet-aligned country. A new government was established with Taraki as prime minister. At the beginning, the PDPA tried to make sure that the two major factions in the party, the Khalq and the Parcham, would be in equal standing. Taraki and Amin, who became foreign minister, were both Khalqists, the faction that was mostly responsible for the coup, and this uneven contribution ended with them ousting most of the Parchamite members of the government in mid-1978. This was a problem for the Soviets, who greatly favored the more moderate Parcham faction, and this, in turn, was a problem for the Khalqists, who needed Soviet support. And so they began to arrest and execute every Parchamite member they could find, because you can't support a group of people if that group of people no longer exists. Due to a combination of the horrifying purges of the Parchamites and the wildly unpopular reforms instituted by Taraki, anti-PDPA rebellions began all over the country. Pakistan quickly took notice of these rebellions and lobbied for the United States to send aid to the rebels, and by May of 1979, the US had started to supply them with equipment. Around this time, ideological differences led to Taraki being overthrown by Amin. While Taraki was certainly not a popular leader, it was Amin that most people held responsible for the purges, and his rise to power only invigorated the rebels. This made the Soviets nervous, and they knew that they needed an excuse to intervene. Luckily for them, Amin requested military intervention, and so on Christmas Day 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Within 2 days of the invasion, Soviet troops arrived in Kabul, and by the following morning, Spetsnaz agents had assassinated Amin and secured the city. Afghanistan was now occupied by the Soviet Union. That same day, the Soviets installed Babrak Karmal, previously the highest-ranking Parchamite member of the PDPA, as head of state. Meanwhile, the US had been hoping that the Afghan rebels would establish some sort of US-friendly regime once they took over. However, that obviously didn't happen, and a country they had interest in had just been conquered by their biggest enemy. Because of this, the United States greatly increased its aid to the rebels, which led to the rise of what is today known in the West as the Mujahideen. While the Soviets took the major cities and the highways connecting them, the Mujahideen held firmly onto the countryside, and by 1985, the Soviets hadn't made any real progress. With mounting pressure from the Western world, it became clear that there was no real point in continuing to occupy the country, so they began to plan for a withdrawal. First, they made sure the Afghan army could handle the Mujahideen on their own, helping to build the Afghan military up to a respectable 300,000 active members. Second, they needed to find a better leader, as Karmal, struggling with his own unpopular set of reforms, was regarded as a lost cause, and they eventually replaced him with Mohammad Najibullah Ahmadzai, the former head of the Afghan secret police. Najibullah tried to legitimize himself among the Afghan people by marketing himself as a strict Muslim, and even expressed willingness to negotiate with the Mujahideen. Unfortunately, Najibullah was still PDPA, and his promises did little to convince the general population. The real end of the occupation came in 1988 with the signing of the Geneva Accords, which outlined a provision for a Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan to be completed by February 15th of the following year. By the agreed upon date, the Soviet Union had left the country. However, However, the government was still receiving support from the Soviet Union, and many Afghans believed that as long as Najibullah was in power, the nation would effectively be a puppet state. And so the invasion transitioned into yet another civil war as the Mujahideen began trying to take back the country. Najibullah's government initially held their own due to the Soviet aid. However, as you may know, the Soviet Union ceased to exist on Christmas Day 1991, and the new Russian Federation was reluctant to continue providing aid. Because of this, there was massive desertion throughout the army as the government became unable to pay their soldiers properly, and Najibullah announced in mid-March of 1992 that he intended to resign. The United Nations stepped in and began to mediate a peace plan between Najibullah and the Mujahideen. At first, both parties agreed that the UN would fly a council of tribal elders into Kabul to establish a temporary governing body and would fly Najibullah out the same day, all while keeping Mujahideen forces outside the city, but the Mujahideen chose to enter the capital anyways. They then came to an agreement with the UN and proclaimed a prominent Mujahideen leader named Segbatullah Mohadedi as acting president. This appointment was greatly undermined by the fact that the Mujahideen weren't actually a single entity, rather a coalition of groups with a common goal of overthrowing the PDPA, and now that that goal had been achieved, they started to fight amongst themselves for control of the country. Eventually, Burhanuddin Rabbani, a prominent leader in the Jamaat faction of the Mujahideen, took over as head of state, but this did little to fix any problems, and in 1994, a new threat emerged. A group of students under the leadership of a man named Mullah Muhammad Omar, unified by their sympathy for the people of Afghanistan, organized a new militia called the Taliban, which had so much success in making cities under their control relatively safe that they were able to capture a third of the country in just a few months. This success got the attention of Pakistan, who began to fund the Taliban in the hopes that they could establish a Pakistan-friendly regime. These hopes were nearly realized in February of 1995 when the Taliban marched on Kabul, but were defeated by Jamaat forces and forced to retreat. Following this setback, the Taliban continued battling the Mujahideen for control of major urban centers. With the Taliban growing stronger every day, two of the biggest Mujahideen forces, Rabbani's government and the Hezb-e Islami, would join forces to defend Kabul from the approaching Taliban wave. They created a new group known as the United Front, which was quickly joined by several more Mujahideen factions, but still, it was too late. On September 25th, the Mujahideen started evacuating to continue the fight from the north, and by the following day, the Taliban had taken Kabul with minimal resistance. They quickly established a government which came in the form of a brutal dictatorship under the direction of Omar. It was one of the worst regimes in Afghan history. Death and torture were not uncommon in the cities, and the Taliban's increasingly harsh demands for NGOs in the country led to almost all foreign aid being cut off by 1998. They also continued to push north against the United Front, now called the Northern Alliance, and by their peak in 2000, they controlled around 90% of the country. This is the point in the story where we introduce yet another key player, a man by the name of Osama bin Laden. Born into a wealthy Saudi family, Osama used his money and influence to help recruit soldiers for the Mujahideen during the Soviet invasion. He created a group called Al-Qaeda, or the Base, in 1988, with the goal of bringing holy war across the globe and establishing a new world order under Sharia law. Yeah, to say the guy was a little nuts is probably an understatement. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, Osama attempted to convince the King of Saudi Arabia that only Muslim troops should be allowed to fight. When the king allowed US troops to defend the country during Operation Desert Shield, Osama grew furious and began to openly criticize the Saudi government, which led to a downward spiral of him being kicked out of Saudi Arabia, fleeing to Sudan, being kicked out of Sudan, and then fleeing to Afghanistan, where he formed a friendship with Mullah Omar. There, Osama's hatred for the United States grew to a boiling point. He blamed the US for his banishments and believed that American influence in the Middle East would lead to the death of Islam. Because of this, Osama signed a ruling that it was the duty of every Muslim to kill Americans and that the killing of civilians was justified. 4 months later, Al-Qaeda organized 2 simultaneous bombings of US embassies in Africa, in which over 2,000 people were killed, which put him on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. Over the next year and a half, the Americans succeeded in stopping several more Al-Qaeda attacks, but as I'm sure you know by now, one managed to be carried out. And on September 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda operatives hijacked 4 airplanes in the eastern United States, using them as weapons in the single deadliest terror attack in history. The CIA almost immediately linked the attack to Al-Qaeda, and the United States demanded that the Taliban hand over Osama. The Taliban refused, and so on October 17th, 2001, the United States invaded, capturing the majority of the country in just 2 months. What they didn't capture, however, was bin Laden, who took another 10 years for US Special Forces to track down and kill. Once bin Laden was finally eliminated in 2011, the mission of the US changed from retribution to restoration. However, when it became clear that the Taliban weren't going anywhere, the US instead turned to diplomacy. In 2020, the US government and Taliban leaders signed the Doha Agreement, stating that the US would withdraw from Afghanistan by 2021, and that in return, the Taliban would take an active role in preventing terrorist action. In the summer of 2021, as US forces began withdrawing from the country, the Taliban swept through every city, returning to power just as quickly as they had been deposed. And by August 30th, the Taliban were once again in charge. It's hard to know exactly what the situation is like in the country right now. As you can imagine, the Taliban are pretty strict about the kind of information they release to the world, but the general consensus seems to be that there's more stability, but freedom is not an expected luxury. With such a long history of war, who can say if the Taliban will go on to control Afghanistan for decades, or if something else will happen? Maybe there will be a new wave of mujahideen, maybe a fourth foreign power will invade, who knows? And on that note, that is the entire history of the country of Afghanistan from 1709 to 2021. I apologize for any minor inaccuracies, skip details, or mispronunciations. This video took a long time to make, and I really do mean a long time. I'm about 80 hours into this project right now, and that's just as of me recording it, not even editing it. So if you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.